It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrove, and along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello there.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, everybody.
Well, you know, this isn't a true crime podcast, but we sure do spend a lot of time on this program talking about true crimes, corporate crimes. And I'm not just talking about abstract white-collar crime, but negligence and conspiracy that literally injure and kill innocent people. This is no less violent in many cases than the headline-grabbing crime committed by gangsters on the street. That's why in the first half of our show today, we're going to do a deep dive into a decades-long corporate crime spree that would fit right into any popular true crime series. We'll be speaking with Jerry Cox, author of the incendiary book, Killer Airbags, The Deadly Secret Automakers Don't Want You to Know. This book chronicles the shocking, but for anyone who follows the corporate crime beat, not terribly surprising story of how the Takata Corporation equipped tens of millions of airbags with what were essentially pipe bombs. That's the first half of the show. The second half of the show, the stay-at-home order has made, this is a personal note, has made my wife and me acutely aware of the precise days and times our neighbors have scheduled their yard work. We can tell what day it is by the volume of the leaf blower. 3 houses down must be Wednesday. Across the street, Tuesday. The leaf blower has become the suburban equivalent of the country rooster sounding a get the hell out of bed reveille at 7 every morning. You could say it's become a true kitchen table issue for many of us, especially those who live in the leafy suburbs. So in the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Peter Bahouth, former head of Greenpeace, who has written an op-ed for the Dallas Morning News outlining a sweeping solution to this environmental issue. After that, we promised to carve out some time for Ralph to answer your listener questions. You've sent in a lot of fascinating questions that run the gamut from sanctuaries for retired despots to Medicare. And as usual, somewhere in between, we'll take a break to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, we're going to find out what the Oklahoma City bombing and the 2002 Honda Civic have in common. David?
Jerry Cox is an attorney, a longtime champion of airbag mandates, a transportation safety consultant, and the author of Killer Airbags, The Deadly Secret Automakers Don't Want You to Know. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jerry Cox.
Thank you. I consider it a privilege.
Yeah, welcome, Jerry. This book that you published, it was the biggest recall in automotive history by far. Tens of millions of cars had these Takata airbags, and the book was not accepted by any publisher. You had to publish it essentially yourself, which reflects on the publisher's unwillingness to put out a book that affects tens of millions of motorists. As we speak, listeners, your cars may have this airbag. It may not have been recalled, or if it was recalled, it's not recalled properly. So in order for people to know that you know what you're talking about, you actually was a consultant to Takata Company. Tell us about that and what happened before we get into the details of the defect in this airbag technology.
Yeah, this is an insider tell-all. And what it shows, and I think one of the reasons there's been a lot of resistance to the book, is it shows that our entire system of consumer protection, especially in the automotive area, is corrupt in spite of everything you did, Ralph, in getting the 1966 Motor Vehicle Safety Act passed. My understanding is that when you were there in the White House and Lyndon Johnson handed you a copy of one of the pens he used to sign the statute, your first thought was, now the work really starts. You know, will the regulators be captured? Will money always trump, pardon me for using that word, will money trump safety? And what this book shows is that's exactly what's happened here.
But you advised Takata when this thing was all over the news to tell the truth, didn't you, when you were a consultant? You were a paid consultant to Takata.
That's exactly right. I mean, the American executives realized that the company was not going to be able to continue ignoring this, even though they'd had a lot of help from inside NHTSA. Inside the government itself was really helping them hide what was going on. And what I told them at the very beginning of my engagement with them at the beginning of 2014 was that this whole issue about whether ammonium nitrate the explosive that they were using to inflate the airbag, whether that was a good design choice or not, was something they had to address. And if it wasn't, they needed to say so. They needed to be truthful about it.
Okay, before we get into that, there's an item in your book that really caught my attention. Takata is a Japanese company, and the middle-aged executive running it got a call from his 73-year-old mother one day. What happened?
Well, he was actually taken to the woodshed, and this has been reported in Reuters and other places. He was taken to the woodshed about the way things were going with this particular issue. So his mom, who had played a major role in the expansion of the company under Shigesa Takada's dad, she had a very close relationship with a former U.S. Secretary of Transportation, and he had a different approach that he thought they should follow, different from what I was suggesting, which was to tell the truth and deal with the problems and work with the car manufacturers and so forth to transition away from dangerous inflators to inflators that might cost more, which certainly would have cost more, but would have been safer. And the difference in the approach was my approach, which was be honest, deal with it, and the approach that the former U.S. Secretary of Transportation suggested to Shige Takata was send me money and I will go out and hire every breathing former administrator of NHTSA I can find and have them put together a report that will make it look like you're being honest about the problems and the mistakes that have occurred in the past.
Well, when she called him in to the woodshed, as you said, what did she do?
Well, nobody knows exactly. The only thing is he disappeared from the top of the skyscraper in downtown Tokyo for several hours. And when he came back, he was reported to be more rattled than anybody had ever seen him. And that was some time after I worked for them. I worked for the company from the beginning of 2014 to the end, because by the end of the year, there had been revelations about the fact that the company had faked test results. When they had chosen explosive, they were basically choosing ingredients that were a fraction of the cost, just 10% of the cost of ingredients everybody else was using.
Well, you're jumping ahead of the story. I want to make a point here.
Please
he was
do.
called in by his mother. She admonished him. That's the tradition of shame in Japan that escapes executives in the U.S. Can you imagine a Boeing executive being called in by his mother for what he was doing? And yet, none of this tradition kept the Takata company from being a serial criminal, which you're going to go on and describe, and diving into bankruptcy and escaping criminal punishment for any of its executives, whether in the U.S. or Japan. Correct?
Well, I've not seen any report of any physical violence between her and him. The point is that corporate governance was non-existent there. But that's not the only element of our system that failed, because the agency was complicit in allowing this to go on much longer than it should have before they started doing any major recalls. The criminal justice system failed consumers totally. The bankruptcy courts have done everything they can to protect the guilty and just about nothing to protect the victims, many of whom are yet to be victimized. And our tort system also has failed, partly because the bankruptcy court took away the money that would pay contingent fees. I mean, we still have a system where people get redress by going to a plaintiff's lawyer who's going to work not because the plaintiff has a whole bunch of money to pay them, but because they anticipate an award. And so the system took that out, and the plaintiff's bar has also kind of stepped aside in these cases.
All right. Now, before we get into the economic decision that Takata made to put a cheaper inflator in compared to its other competitor, tell our listeners what companies had this airbag installed and how many of these airbags have been recalled. Just go through what has been done so far and the role of Honda.
Well, first of all, just about every manufacturer eventually went for these cheap inflators, but it was Honda that cooked up the idea, working alongside Takata back around 2000, because they wanted to keep the prices down, to keep profit margins higher on cars they were going to sell in the United States. So they're the ones who went to Takata, which had no experience in making, had very little experience in making airbags at that point, and certainly no experience in dealing with explosives. And Honda said, this is what we want. And Takata, as the chairman, Shigesa Takata, often said, what Honda wants, Honda gets. And that's how the whole thing started, was back in 2000 for 2001, 2002 model year Accords and some other cars that were put out by Honda.
Now, we're going to tell you listeners about Jerry Cox's website right now to keep you gripping with what's going to be revealed. Jerry, tell them how they can find out whether their car has been recalled and recalled effectively, because we're talking about tens of millions of cars here, with a defect that apparently started around 2003, year after year, by the Takata company.
Well, killerairbags.com is the only place I know of that people can go to and find two different ways to check the current recall status of their car. One of those ways is to go to a government website and try typing in 17 digits of your VIN. You can figure out where to find it, and people can, but it's not that easy for your average guy to figure out all those 17 digits and to type it all in correctly.
That's the vehicle identification number.
Right.
VIN. Every car has it.
Which you and John Claybrook played such an incredibly important role in getting those established so that each car has like a birth certificate, a unique identifier. And if you can type those 17 digits in correctly, you might get a hit that tells you that your car is under recall and you need to schedule it with a dealer of that brand of car and to get it repaired. And you might not get a hit today, but you might get a hit tomorrow because it's a rolling recall that's now been going on for 6 years. And you're going to see millions more additional cars that are going to get into that database. You're going to have to check on a really regular basis. The other way to check, and that I think you can only learn about from killerairbags.com, is an app that you can get at the Apple Store, and it will allow you to take a photograph of your license plate or somebody else's license plate, and it will correlate that with the VIN and tell you whether there's a hit at this moment or not.
Enlighten our listeners about the exact defect and why.
Well, as I said before, Takata figured out that they could spend 10% if they went to something called ammonium nitrate, and we hear about it because it's what blew up over in Lebanon. It's what took the Murrah Federal Building off the map in Oklahoma City. It's really a volatile and very powerful explosive, and it's cheap. And Takata figured out that like I said, it was only 10% of the cost of other explosives that people were using, other fuels people were using to make inflators inflate airbags. And when they did that, they started out doing validation tests and so forth to see how well it would work. And those tests showed that it would explode. And instead of telling Honda in reports that were done in the United States, instead of telling Honda this stuff shows a propensity to explode, they told them that it was all fine and dandy, and they faked the test reports. And they just kept right on faking the test reports for years, every time there were issues and every time people were getting killed. And initially it was only a few people. I mean, that's easy for me to say. It's not me or my family that got blown up. They had their faces rearranged or their heads blown off or whatever. It's easy to say. It was very few people. And it got to the point finally by 2009 that people at NHTSA were noticing it, and they started an investigation, and then mysteriously the investigation got closed down, and nobody's ever explained why that happened.
Is that because the fatality rate was so small compared to the tens of millions of cars with these airbags?
You'd have to ask the person who made that decision at NHTSA. The administrator at that time was a guy named David Strickland, and I hope somebody will ask him why that investigation got closed down in 2009.
David Strickland is now the chief of staff for the Senate Transportation Committee. So if you want to ask him any questions, that's how you can reach him.
Well, I know where to find him, and it's going to be interesting to see what the Biden administration does about appointing a new NHTSA administrator, because all of this mess, and we could go on for another 2 hours talking about what a mess this is, all of it could be solved pretty effectively if President Biden were to pick somebody who is not expecting to leave NHTSA after, if he's going to put somebody in to run NHTSA, he needs to pick somebody who's not going to be immediately looking for a job from the car companies, because that's what we've had for years is people who go through this revolving door. And they're in the government one day, and then they're working for the car companies the next day. Then they're back in the government and back and forth and back and forth. And that's exactly what my book exposes. That's the fundamental problem with that agency is, and also I think to some extent with the criminal justice system, is that the people who are supposed to be protecting consumers have the number one objective to make money from the people who have money in all this, which is the Takatas and Hondas and all of the other vehicle manufacturers and the other parts of that industry. If that's on their minds, then you're never going to get this problem solved.
Well, let's get to the technical issue here. The other auto companies signed contracts with Takata to put the airbag with ammonium nitrate in their cars.
19 of those car manufacturers, yes.
Okay. Why didn't they make their own determination? Or did they say to themselves, well, Honda's bought it. Honda has a great reputation. We don't have to really test this type of inflator, so let's buy it.
That's one of the issues in the pending civil cases that are pending. There's a multi-district litigation going on in Miami, and the plaintiffs have argued that the car manufacturers either did that and knew the answer but liked the numbers, or that they didn't do it and should have checked, before making their decision to incorporate that into their cars. But the car manufacturer's position is that they're victims of Takata, and which is easy to say since Takata is bankrupt and out of the picture. So I think that litigation is going to be really crucial. There's also some consumer litigation going on in Australia under a statute there, unlike what we have here, that allows people to recover against the car sellers, not the car manufacturers, allows people to recover from them just for being lied to about how safe their cars were. And that, I think, also discovery might show what the other car manufacturers, Honda and the others, what they actually knew when they decided to buy these cheap inflators.
Well, what's the latest estimate of the fatality toll and the injury toll?
There are at least 30 people, by my count, 32, but the official NHTSA announcement as of Monday, when they turned down a so-called petition for inconsequentiality that Ford filed, is that there have been at least 30 people killed. We're getting on to the number of getting close to 36 at this point. There have been 30 people killed and hundreds of people injured, and nobody knows how many people were injured except perhaps the Harvard law professor who is in the process of divvying up the crumbs that were left to victims in the bankruptcy proceedings.
Well, the listener might be saying right now, Jerry Cox, we're talking to Jerry Cox, author of the book Killer Airbags, The Deadly Secret Automakers Don't Want You to Know. This is a particular painful subject because airbags supposed to be identified with saving lives, and here's a corporation that turned it into a sporadic, deadly mechanism that threw shrapnel inside the motor vehicle when it exploded. Now, obviously, this is an airbag design that worked millions of times over the entire planet. What made it not work in the fraction of times that it was inflated?
The problem with ammonium nitrate is that over time it deteriorates. In other words, the car lasts a lot longer than the airbag does, and a lot longer than that chemical does. And when that happens, you get, not to get too much into the science of this, but we're supposed to follow the science nowadays. The science is that the propellant that's put inside the airbag inflator canister crumbles, and that creates a greater surface area. And that's true with just about any explosive, I think, that if you have a greater surface area and it ignites, it's going to give you a bigger boom. And it doesn't just inflate the airbag, it blows up the metal. And that's how you get shrapnel flying at people.
And what difference do temperatures in the tropics or in the northern hemisphere, Canada, does that affect the deterioration process?
That has been shown by a number of different studies. What it really is, again, getting into the science here, it's temperature cycling in a humid environment. That's like your worst case scenario. And those are where most of the fatalities have occurred. Not all of them, but most of the fatalities have occurred when the cars have been driven in environments where you start out early in the day, maybe with a lower temperature, like in California, you start out chilly and then it gets hot and humid if you're up in the valley or something, and that makes it deteriorate faster than if it's in Minnesota and the highest temperature it ever sees is, 72 degrees in somebody's garage.
What's the nature of the fix when they are recalled by the dealers? You get a recall notice and you take your car down to the dealer. What's the nature of the fix?
Well, the fix that NHTSA agreed to back in 2015 was to allow Takata Corporation to replace old defective inflators with new defective inflators. In other words, just restart the clock. That's not a good solution, but the only solution that anybody has ever been able to come up with is to replace the ammonium nitrate inflators with inflators that do not have ammonium nitrate in them. And NHTSA did not insist on that at the beginning of this process. And that's about the only thing that can be done is to take them out and start over again. And the problem economically is that the auto manufacturers do not want to do that. And the General Motors and Ford petitions that NHTSA finally denied, that were taking out the trash, once the Trump people weren't there to watch them anymore, they took the trash out and denied those petitions in which those two car companies were saying, well, just because our supplier says these things are going to blow up and kill people doesn't mean we really have to replace them, does it? And the answer from NHTSA 4 years later was, yeah, you do. And that's the only real solution is from a physical standpoint, is to get them the hell out of these cars.
Are you saying that some of the replacement airbags contained ammonium nitrate?
Oh, absolutely. That was part of what NHTSA agreed to back in 2015. And what that means, of course, is that people would have to replace their airbags not once, but twice. So most people think if I had a defective airbag and I had it replaced, I'm good. I don't have to worry about it again. Don't need to be typing 17 digits into a government website. They think they're good to go, and they're not, because all they got was an airbag inflator with a longer fuse on it, a pipe bomb with a longer fuse.
Well, let's look at the competitor. The major competitor has a different type of inflator. Describe the name of the competitor and their design, which hasn't had this problem.
Well, there are several other competitors, and they obviously have been very busy making replacement inflators. One of them, and a company that I worked with quite a bit when I was on Capitol Hill and trying to mandate airbags in cars, trying to sort of realize the dream that you laid out in 1966, and that's a German-based company called TRW. And they've had their own issues because one of their inflators, apparently, just based on a defect information report that got filed with NHTSA, one of those exploded and killed somebody in a Volvo. And I have to wonder, the way they're keeping so quiet, try to find any information on what's happening with that one.
What kind of inflator do they use?
That's a secret. They keep that a secret, but they will tell you, and I'm sure it's true, it is not ammonium nitrate.
Well, in your book, you have something pretty unique for an expose book. It's in part 7, and it says, do-it-yourself auto safety. This is right for you listeners. And you have basically 4 action items. One of them is really the reverse, but do you want to go through those?
Yes, and first of all, I'd like to say it's just an absolute shame. I mean, what you confronted, Ralph, back in the early 60s, was a situation where people had to protect themselves and they had almost nothing to cling to. And so because of your work, the Safety Act was passed in 1966. NHTSA was established supposedly to enforce those laws. So the government's supposed to do something to help you, but they're not. Nobody's doing anything to help you. So what you need to do as a consumer is, number one, don't wait for a paper recall notice to come to you. Recognize when you hear this, check your own, then do it on a regular basis. Convince people you love to do the same thing. If you know people who care about this system, about the corruption of this system, share the book with them, or at least let them know what's in the book so that they know how bad things have gotten. But number one is don't wait for a piece of paper to come in the mail. Number two is if you find out that a car has an outstanding safety recall, then take it in and get it repaired. For God's sake, don't be driving it. That would be true whether it's your car or whether it's a rental or whatever. If it's got something in there that can kill you, then you sure as heck ought not to be driving it. The other thing is if you think that you have some kind of recourse, if you have your face rearranged or if a member of your family gets killed or something like that, you can forget about suing Takata. It really can't be done, and suing the car manufacturers isn't a whole lot easier. And then the fourth thing, which everybody has ignored, I mean, as far as I can tell, nobody has picked up on this except you, Ralph, and that is to demand government action, to let people in the government know, let your congressman know, let your governor know. Now, I can explain later what the governors could do about this, but let people in Congress know that this is an outrage, that this situation shouldn't exist. And one way you can do that is I've got things set up so that under an agreement with Amazon, if you have a legislator that you want to hear about this and you want them to have a copy of the book, you can buy a discounted copy off of the website. You go to the Amazon point of sale and buy one of the $14 copies, and that gives me an opportunity to inscribe it any way that you want, and I can be reached at the email address on the website at killerairbags.com or through my Twitter handle, which is Jerry W. Cox at Jerry W. Cox digit 1, number 1.
Now, you're saying you can't sue Takata because Takata is bankrupt and the pieces were picked up by some other company in Asia. But what about the manufacturers whose engineers missed the cues? They should have, in effect, discovered the problems of ammonium nitrate early in the 21st century. What about their vulnerability, and are the tort lawyers suing them?
The bankruptcy judge issued an injunction against any lawsuits against Takata, but he also issued channeling injunctions that affect your ability to recover from a car manufacturer as well. It depends on which manufacturer it is. It shouldn't depend on that, but it does. And if you sue a company that has entered into some kind of settlement agreement, you have to go through an administrative process, which can take years, and see what kind of a result you get from that out of GM or whomever. You have to go through that process, and only then can you go to court. Other cases, you can go directly to court, but if you try, I'm from Kansas City, you go to Jackson County Circuit Court, you're going to end up in the multi-district litigation in Miami, and the people making decisions about what you're going to get out of the case are going to be the people on the steering committee, not your own lawyer. So it made it extremely complicated to go after them, but it can be done. And also, I honestly believe that used car dealers who sell 40 million cars a year, these are where these killer airbags are, is in these used cars that have been around for a while. The used car dealers figured that they're okay as long as they put something down in all that boilerplate in the contract of sale. If they say, hey, you're taking on the responsibility for this, this isn't our problem just because we're selling you a car that can kill you, sooner or later, some enterprising plaintiff's lawyer is going to find a way to go against them directly, and it's not going to be affected by anything that happened in the bankruptcy court. People will be able, I think, to figure that out and go after used car dealers who more and more are not your mom and pop on the corner kind of outfit. They're more and more larger corporate organizations that have somewhat deeper pockets.
Yeah, this whole corporate crime affected, according to your book, 70 million vehicles. 70 million vehicles. What kind of letter are you writing to the new Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg?
Well, I think that it's going to be crucial that he understand, because he's got no background in transportation that I know of, he needs to understand that, he needs to have people working with him in the general counsel's office, at NHTSA as administrator and deputy administrator and so forth. He has to free up. And I would tell him that he needs to make sure those are people who are going to put consumers first and not be thinking about their own future as consultants or lawyers or whatever for car companies, because that's not happened in recent years. It would be a huge improvement if Secretary Buttigieg were to do that, if President Biden were to appoint somebody to run NHTSA who really is there for consumers. It's not just lip service, but that's really what they're there for.
Well, it'd be good for you to write him a letter explaining all this and what you want him to do, so that listeners who contact him or the press who contact him knows that he can't say he didn't know about the details. They can say, well, you received this letter from Jerry Cox. He was an advisor to Takata. He told them to tell the truth. They didn't tell the truth. He exposed them in this book. What's taking you so long to start a new era at NHTSA, the auto safety agency under your jurisdiction, Secretary?
Right. I'm happy. I'm happy to do that. I'm hoping that, and I have no relationship with the new secretary any way, shape, or form. I've never worked with anybody involved with his campaign or anything like that. As you know, my background is with Jack Danforth. You were at Princeton with him back in the 50s. And I don't know that he's plugged in particularly with Pete Buttigieg or even with President Biden in any way. But what I'm hoping is that one of your listeners does have some relationship with the secretary or somebody close to him, and that they will get a copy of the book, have it sent, just indicate the address and the person to whom it's sent, and I can inscribe it and write a note exactly like that to the secretary or anybody else that any of the listeners want to contact.
We'll do that. We'll put it up on our website, nader.org, so listeners can follow up. I've heard recently that the new general counsel for NHTSA is a very good lawyer from California who's worked in consumer protection, and she comes very well regarded. So that's a good first step. They haven't yet nominated the head of NHTSA. That's coming probably in the next couple of weeks or so. Thank you very much, Jerry. So we're looking forward to those two letters. We'll put them up on nader.org, and we'll try to rally around the new administration.
Thank you for the opportunity to get the word out to people. It's so important to me.
You're very welcome. Keep it up.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Jerry Cox. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we return, we'll be discussing the environmental impact of a common neighborhood nuisance. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 29, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. China has sentenced the former chairman of one of the country's biggest state-owned asset management companies to death on bribery and corruption charges. That's according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. Lau Chi-min, chairman of China Huarong Asset Management from 2012 to 2018, when he was fired for graft, was accused by a local Chinese court in the northern city of Tianjin of taking bribes totaling a record high of more than 1.79 billion won, equivalent to $277 million. Lau's crimes were particularly serious, the court said, given the scale of his bribery, which included several transactions in the hundreds of millions of won each, as well as the act of proactively soliciting bribes. The court characterized him as being lawless and extremely greedy. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. In these dark days, with unemployment numbers higher than we've seen since the Great Depression, I'm glad that the man brandishing the leaf blower in my neighborhood has a job. But I'm also a little miffed that apparently his job is to blow a single leaf 5 feet away from where nature dropped it, pursuing it with the relentless intensity of Liam Neeson cornering a Russian mobster who has, once again, against all odds, kidnapped his daughter. Am I the only person with strong feelings on this topic? David?
This is what our next guest recently wrote in the Dallas Morning News. Operating a gas-powered leaf blower for 1 hour emits smog-forming pollution comparable to driving a 2017 Toyota Camry about 1,100 miles, or approximately the distance from Chicago to Houston. Particulate matter linked to cancers, heart disease, asthma, and other serious ailments lingers in the air for days in droplets so small that the body has no way to filter them from entering the lungs. Most affected are children, the elderly, and of course the operators of these machines. That was written by Peter Bahouth. He is a former executive director of Greenpeace USA and the U.S. Climate Action Network. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Peter Bahouth.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Welcome, Peter. Well, listeners should know that Peter was one of the great environmental leaders in the world. He led many a demonstration, and when he headed Greenpeace, he was in many countries. He was a real dynamo, and he knows what he's talking about when it comes to leaf blowers. Let me ask you this question. Leaf blowers have many consequences. One is they feed the excess weight epidemic in this country. It's really amazing to watch people who are quite able-bodied, many of them in their 20s and 30s, instead of picking up a rake, and raking, like in the old days, they use this gas-powered leaf blower with all the bad effects. Question number one, is there such a thing as a battery-operated leaf blower to avoid the air pollution problems in the immediate vicinity?
There is, Ralph, but they have their own problems. Okay, they don't emit the particulate matter and the unburned gas and oil from the gas-powered, but they do have other problems. But let's go back to something you said, which is about the obesity. My first job as a kid was raking leaves. It was a good way to raise a little money, stay in the neighborhood. The temperature was good. The leaves were, pretty colors. You got to talk to your neighbors. It was my first job. And, there still are rakers out there. And because people think that I'm kind of like the neighborhood crank complaining about the leaf blowers, I started giving away what I call the Golden Rake Award. I made a little miniature golden rake, and whenever I see somebody raking, I pull over, I give them a little golden rake, and I give them like a box of cookies or some other kind of thing, a gift card to a coffee shop or something, just to reward them for raking. And that's one thing that actually people have paid a little attention to because, people don't like controversy in the neighborhood. So the Golden Rake Award is kind of a positive way to let people know that it's appreciated. They're keeping the neighborhood a little quieter and a little less polluted.
What's astonishing is that the leaf blowers are oblivious. I mean, they're hearing the noise, they're breathing the fumes, they're pushing other pollution on the streets when they upend the leaves that they're gathering together in some manner. I could never figure out what they're being discomforted too.
The people that are operating them, they're going to be losing their hearing and they're going to have respiratory problems. But it takes some time. I mean, particulate matter is the reason it's called particulate. It's so fine. It's, as you said, it can't be filtered before it gets into the lungs. It's so tiny. Gas-powered leaf blowers only burn about 60 to 70% of the fuel. The rest of it is atomized out into the air. So you've got an engine on people's back that would be illegal on the lake, by the way, illegal on the street, by the way, but you can use it in your backyard, right? Now, if people did go to electric leaf blowers, that would be a step in the right direction. But here's the problem. First of all, they're noisy. I mean, if you hear leaf blowers 3 to 5 hours a day, you can't close your ears to that noise. That's just going to disrupt whatever you're doing. If you're a musician, if you're a writer, if you're trying to concentrate, have a conversation, talk to your baby, if it's the first thing you hear in the morning, it could drive you crazy. The other thing is, there's no waste in nature. Leaves aren't litter. Leaves are very important. So that's why, the autumn season is very important. It's a resting time before hibernation, but it's where the fireflies put their larvae, luna moths, right? All sorts of pollinators. So what you're doing is you're wiping out all sorts of wildlife, even if you're using an electric leaf blower, because you're just sterilizing nature. And nature is all around us. It's not somewhere you go. We have nature in our backyard.
You got terrible noise. You got terrible pollution. Why aren't they being regulated?
I'll tell you why they aren't being regulated. These fights, unfortunately, it pits neighbor versus neighbor. And neighbors don't like to do that, right? There's no national organization, Ralph. Well, there's a couple. There's Quiet Communities. I think 350.org takes a look at it. But there's no organization that's really, say, going after the manufacturers, right? Or providing any cover for the neighbors or the community groups that are trying to do something about it. So there's no resources. There's no media. There's no research. Nobody's going after the manufacturer. There's 325 communities around the country trying to ban or regulate leaf blowers. And they start from scratch every single time. Because I think the manufacturers know.
From scratch? You mean?
In other words, if your neighborhood wants to do something about leaf blowers, where do you go for information? You have to start from scratch. You have to organize from scratch. You have no air support. You know what I mean by that? No air cover. There's nobody at the national level that's saying, here's the latest information. Here's the latest science. Here's up-to-date science. Here's the group that's going after the manufacturers and trying to get them to, pushing them. There's no cover. So it's basically a ground game, neighbor versus neighbor, with no national air support.
But why isn't Greenpeace?
So let me give you an example, Ralph. Let me give you an example. With what we know about these engines, and because they would be illegal any place except in your backyard, why isn't there a study on the particulate matter in our neighborhoods after these things come through every day? There's not even a college or a university or an organization that's doing those studies so that we have that information. Why not? There's no resources. There's no grants that have gone to this fight. Ralph, I asked you a few weeks ago, what's the most dangerous product you can buy? What's the most dangerous consumer product right now? You said food, right? And that may be true generally, but as an individual product, leaf blowers, they destroy hearing. They're terrible for respiratory. They're not regulated in any way. The air that comes out of the end of these leaf blowers, Ralph, 200 miles an hour. It's like a hurricane in your backyard, spewing gas, and making noise.
Given what you say, why aren't major environmental groups working on this? What about Greenpeace? You used to head Greenpeace. We're talking with Peter Bahouth. Why aren't local or national environmental groups getting on this?
I don't know, Ralph. It's a mystery to me. I think there really needs to be a national effort on leaf blowers. Now, there used to be an office of noise pollution. Ronald Reagan did away with it.
That's correct.
You know that?
That's correct.
Noise pollution is a big issue. It can really harm people's hearing. And, of course, it's very disruptive. They had an office that looked into noise pollution. It doesn't exist anymore, right? So that's one thing. But in terms of the particulate matter, it's really shocking to me that you can use these machines in your backyard when you wouldn't be allowed to use them up on the street or on a lake in your marine engine. But that's how little attention there's been paid to this, that's still allowed. And I can't for the life of me figure out why an organization like Audubon that's concerned about birds and pollinators, or Greenpeace, wouldn't be doing an effort on this. I mean, I know they all have their hands full, but I can't stand it when I see all of these communities around the country just struggling on their own, trying to get a hold of how to deal with it. And what happens at the local level, Ralph, by the way, if you do get your city council, through enormous Herculean effort to do something about this, how do they enforce it? What do? Call the police and say there's a leaf blower next door? They'll be gone by the time they come, And on what basis are you regulating them? Is it noise levels? It's like it's telling the police to come to a party. They'll ask you to turn it down and go.
Yeah,
there's no enforcement.
You cite the home that's using the...
No, Ralph. No,
because they do that all the time for noisy parties, nuisance doctrine.
Yeah, but Ralph, see, you got to understand, by the time they come, they're gone. What's happening is there's these landscaping companies. It's like an invasion. It's like an invasion in the morning. You get these landscaping companies, they do 10 properties and they leave. Most of the times the owners aren't even home. They don't hear it. They might be at work. It's a little different now because people are home. Their kids are home because of COVID. It's a little different. People are noticing it much, much more. I will say that. So there is an awareness that's gaining on this, but we've got a long way to go. And the fact that there is no air support for this is a little tough.
Well, you're pretty rationally passionate about this. Why don't you send the same letter to 10 environmental groups and ask them to do something?
I do send it to them. I do write about it. There's a couple of Facebook pages, and if you go on Facebook, and I don't get one.
What's the response?
I don't get one.
Oh.
Now, maybe I'm writing to the wrong people. You know how it is, but It's just, I've told people, I tried to promote the op-ed that I wrote in Dallas. I put it on my Facebook page. I sent it to people. I've got it on Greenpeace alumni. But it's...
Well, the best approach, Peter, is prevention. That is, you regulate the manufacturing, design, and construction of these leaf blowers.
Nobody's working on the manufacturers. That's what I mean by no air support, no national effort. Nobody's working on the manufacturers. You can't expect these neighborhood groups to be going after the manufacturers. They don't have the skills. They don't have the tools for that. They don't have the resources.
Well, you got a new administration. You got a new EPA head and other regulators. So it seems to me that if you had a poll, that there'd be a lot of people against these leaf blowers. Has there been a poll?
But there's something else about this, Ralph. There's something else about this. When I go up and down my street, there's not a leaf on a lawn. We've given up the idea of sanctuary in our home where we're not being disturbed by noise and pollution for the sanctity of the lawn, okay? Do you know what the number one crop in the United States is? Lawn, 40 million acres. It's the number one crop in the United States is our lawns. So everybody says, well, the guy next door to me, he doesn't have any leaves on his lawn. I can't have any leaves on his lawn. That's how we show that we're nice and neat and tidy, right? So, there's not even, we've lost a connection to this whole season is the problem. We've lost this connection to think that leaves aren't dangerous, that they don't cause any harm. They don't have to be removed. I'm telling you, I can hear an hour of these leaf blowers, Ralph, simply because the owner next door doesn't want to see a leaf when he goes from his car to his door at night. That's how bad it's gotten. And, it's gone way beyond aren't these things an annoyance. It's like, when are we going to stop being so rude? When are we going to start understanding that nature has cycles? That there's no waste in nature, that leaves aren't litter. If you need to rake up leaves or if you need to remove them once or twice a year, fine. But every week so there's not a leaf around? When did leaves ever hurt us?
How do people reach you with some feedback or requests?
Well, I have an email. It's P as in Peter, B as in boy, AHOUTH @gmail.com.
David, Steve, you want to jump in here?
There's
some Facebook pages too, Ralph. Tell people that there are Facebook pages ban leaf blowers. If they just look up leaf blowers, you'll see some Facebook pages, and that's kind of helpful.
They can't even get snowmobiles banned from like places like Yosemite and jet skis on lakes. What about getting an army of activists? You rent 50 leaf blowers and stand outside Black & Decker headquarters and just keep the leaf blowers going for all day.
I don't want to.
I would join you if you did that.
There have been times where I'm just pulling out my hair during the day, listening to things. There's something very wrong about the first sound you hear in the morning is this whining.
Why not find out where the CEO
right?
of Black & Decker lives and just stand outside his home all day?
As I said, that's not the kind of thing that the people that are affected by this want to do. It's neighbors. It's neighbors. They don't want to be in conflict with their neighbors. They want to share cookies with their neighbors. Whenever, I've lived in my neighborhood for 22 years. Every time I've had a discussion or a disagreement with a neighbor, everybody brings the cookies out. They don't, it's like, okay, settle down. People want a calm neighborhood. This is disruptive to the neighborhood, but they don't really know they don't want to confront their neighbors. They need more help than that. Now, the idea that you have, sure, I think that there could be organized where we go out there. But what's that going to do? I mean, is that going to they're going to know you're going to go away? We need consistent national attention on this with some national resources. There's not even a grant to any organization on this issue. There's not one single grant to do anything, put out good material, to get some good studies done, to do some scientific surveys, to do some media about it. There's not one foundation that supports action on this.
Peter, but while we're talking, I've been interrupted by 4 robocalls. So you get the robocalls inundating people inside their homes and these leaf blowers and other similar equipment outside their homes. There's got to be a dramatic way to raise visibility. And what David is saying is what you used to do up there in Alaska. You get in front of Black & Decker with all these leaf blowers and you'll get national news. And that's the first step. Well, we're out of time, but this is something which definitely will be continued. We'll follow your challenges as they occur to you, and we'll see what else around the country can be mobilized on this.
Hey, thanks for giving me the opportunity to be on.
You're welcome.
We've been speaking to Peter Bahouth. We will link to his op-ed at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's do some listener questions. David, start us off.
This first question comes to us from Ali Muharrab. Dear Ralph Nader and the Ralph Nader Radio Hour crew, I'm a longtime listener to the show and longtime fan of your work. My parents held a fundraiser for your 2000 presidential campaign, which familiarized me with you at an early age. I've been a staunch supporter since, even having the opportunity to see you speak in Portland a couple of times. I studied philosophy at the University of Oregon, and as you might suspect, there's little demand for the philosopher these days, either in or out of the workplace. And although I take pride in my various creative pursuits or helping with a family business, I can't help but want more out of life. And your path is nothing short of inspirational to me. My question for you, Ralph, is simple. Should I go back to school for law? And how could I help change the world for the better if I do? Thank you for being such a cogent and powerful voice in the age of disinformation.
Well, thank you, Ali. I would always urge people to go to law school because they can become more powerful citizens even if they don't practice law. It's a tremendous tool. And if you're still in Portland, contact a public interest lawyer whose name is Greg Kafoury. He's well known in the Portland area, Kafoury. He's a tort lawyer. He also goes up against a lot of official brutal behavior in Portland. And he was named Trial Lawyer of the Year. And I think he would resonate with what you want to do in the future and give you some good advice.
Okay, very good, Ali. Hope you can connect with Greg. Our next question comes from Cynthia Dean, and she writes, Ralph, wasn't it your father who posited the need for a safe haven for despots and dictators, a sanctuary where they could go without fear, thus enabling them to depart without waiting to be deposed? Thought of this, read the Trumpman family.
Wow.
Well, he was talking at dinner one day, and we were talking about why dictators, after years in office, still stay in office, because they're always surrounded by people who hate them, want them out of office, trying to overthrow them. And they're full of fear themselves. Brutal as they are, they're full of fear. So he thought an incentive to get them to retire would be some island in the southern hemisphere for despots and dictators to quit early and give them a safe sanctuary. Part of it was in jest, but there is this important point that a lot of the reason why these dictators never give it up is because they feel that's the most secure place for their future existence year after year.
I think that island exists. It's called Manhattan, and most of them own all the real estate here.
My idea for Trump is that there's a big patch of plastic the size of Texas, 3 times the size of France, that maybe the Trump family could go and they could build plastic golf courses on it, and we can get some use out of that.
Well, I think Trump may be now looking for a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty to the U.S. if the New York State law enforcers prevail in their cases against him.
This next one is from Carolyn Edessa. She writes, why does the federal government allow private insurers to use the word Medicare in private insurance plans? Most seniors don't understand that when they sign up for an Advantage plan, they're effectively signing out of the federal Medicare insurance program. Although I still work, I'm an $11.99 SEIU retiree. Every few years, $11.99 SEIU attempts to hardball their retirees into switching to an Advantage plan. As of January 1st, 2021, all the retirees were automatically switched to an Aetna Advantage plan unless they fought, as I did, to prevent that from happening.
Well, Carolyn, this is quite a story. If the facts bear you out across the board, SEIU is contracting with a private insurance company and trying to push its retirees into the so-called Medicare Advantage, which I call Medicare Disadvantage plan. And who knows what commissions are changing hands here. AARP is doing the same thing. They're advertising in their AARP bulletin to elderly people to switch to Medicare Disadvantage. They call it Medicare Advantage because they have a contract with a giant United Healthcare insurance company. And already over 40% of people over 65 on Medicare have been lured into these Medicare Disadvantage plans, which were described by Dr. John Gaiman. We've had him on the show. He's coming out with another book called The Medical Industrial Complex. And here's his take. Quote, the claims of private Medicare HMOs that they will deliver better care at a lower price are not substantiated by experience. Instead, they need big government subsidies to make a profit. They often withdraw from markets and are not profitable enough, as happened between 1998 and 2000, when they were paid 13% by the U.S. government more than traditional Medicare, and they left 2.4 million seniors without coverage when they exited the market, end quote. It's a bad deal in many ways. We'll talk about it more when we have Dr. John Gaiman on the program after he publishes his forthcoming book, America's Mighty Medical Industrial Complex, Negative Impacts and Positive Solutions.
Very good. Thanks for that question. This next one comes from David Sandback. And he's interested in, Ralph, your take on Biden's picks and would like to know in particular about what you expect from Gary Gensler, who's been nominated to be the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Well, Gary Gensler's had government experience in other regulatory agency, and he's also had Wall Street experience, and he'll be a better SEC chair than anyone that preceded him in the past few decades. He knows what the score is. Maybe he wants to provide a different type of regulation. The first thing I'm going to ask him is for him to restore the 1982 SEC rule that essentially prohibited almost all stock buybacks, classifying them as deceptive insider trading. Reagan got rid of it, and trillions of dollars have gone down the drain buying stock at the order of the CEOs to increase the yardsticks for their executive compensation. So Contact Chairman Gessler. Tell him what you think needs to be done to protect you as an investor from brokers, banks, and other financial institutions.
This next question comes to us from Evan Weissman. I'd like to connect with Ralph or Steve or David. I run Warm Cookies of the Revolution, a civic health club in Denver. We've been making civic life necessary and fun and weird for almost a decade now. We engage folks who normally aren't involved in civic life, younger people, women, folks of color, and working class people. We do it with comedy and music and culture. We've been making videos during COVID, and also a few different board books will be coming out soon. The ones you read to children, but these are for adults about being civic. It would be good to connect with you. You can see our website, warmcookiesoftherevolution.org, and a project we did on participatory budgeting here at thismachinehasasoul.com. Thanks. Keep up the good work, Evan.
That's a wonderful thing about the questions from our listening audience. Who would have ever known this outside of Denver? It's the kind of creativity that arises around the country that needs greater exposure by the media. So thank you for that idea, and I hope people will connect with the website so they can cook up something similar in their neighborhood.
Thank you for those questions. I want to thank our guests again, Jerry Cox and Peter Bahouth. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has two books, Wrecking America, How Trump's Lies Betrayed All. He wrote that with Mark Green. And also check out the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. We will link to both of those.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we'll be welcoming John Dacey to discuss private prisons and why they should be abolished. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. If you don't want to use Amazon for progressive books, and I urge you not to, there's an online bookstore on the West Coast, counterpunch.org. Go there. You'll see our books and other progressive books available.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we continue our conversations with both Jerry Cox about airbags and Peter Bahouth about leaf blowers. First up, Jerry Cox.
Steve, David, what do you want to know about your car?
Well, I want to know about what was the publisher's excuses, major publishers' excuses for not publishing this book. This reads like a true crime novel.
Nobody cares. That was the answer.
Nobody cares. Wow.
Nobody cares. Now, of course, you have to realize these are all people in Manhattan, and they never ride in the front seats of cars. So I strongly suspect that had something to do with it. But I had a super qualified agent who was convinced that this would sell to the most prominent publishers in New York, and it was a washout. And this was somebody who's done very well with other true crime books about crime and corporate misbehavior and so forth. And it was a huge surprise to him and a huge disappointment to me. And I therefore had to really torture myself over the course of several months whether to put my own resources. I'm putting my own time into this. This is entirely a pro bono activity, the biggest pro bono activity I've had in 42 years of practicing law, to put my time into it and take whatever risks might befall me for doing it. And what it finally came down to was I just couldn't look myself in the mirror in the morning without letting people know about this. And if people care about it and want to share it with other people, that's fantastic. It will save people's lives if they do that. If the publishers are right and nobody cares, well, then there's not much I can do about that other than what I'm doing right now.
How do you get this book, and how do you get discount copies? People might want to place it in their local libraries or library branches if they live in a big city.
Well, that would be a great thing for them to do. And the way to get the discounted copy is $14 is what people should be looking for on the Amazon site, because I have an arrangement with Amazon that allows me to actually inscribe the books on their way out the door. But if they just want to buy a copy and don't want to mess with that, If they just want to see it for themselves, they can either buy the discounted copy or they can pay the full price copy for Amazon or any of the other, Barnes & Noble, any of the other online retailers. Obviously, bookstores are not popular places for people to visit these days, which is unfortunate. But online sales, I think, is where this was going to be from the beginning. And again, any proceeds from the book, there haven't been any so far, but any proceeds from the book will go to transportation safety-related charities. So this is not any way for me to pump up my business. I mean, this is not exactly what you do to try to get corporations to hire you. But, it's not to pump up business. It's not to make me any money. It won't make me any money. What I hope it will do, and the only thing I really care about, is that it save people's lives.
You want a general recall order. Describe exactly what you want the new administration to do now, pick up from the failures of the past.
Well, number one, they need to recognize that the number of vehicles under recall has gone up dramatically under the Trump administration. And as we've discussed previously, Ralph, Trump put Takata's lawyer, the guy who negotiated the sweetheart deal for Takata, became the general counsel at DOT, and then was, for the last year or so, the deputy secretary or acting deputy secretary. And he recused himself, he says, from any involvement, but nobody else took up the slack. The Trump administration never appointed an administrator. Nobody's ever done anything within the agency or the government in 4 years. And so you've gone from, recently it was 12 million cars that were recalled but not fixed. Well, now we're up to 20 million cars as a result of the GM and Ford decisions in the last couple of weeks. We're up to 21 million cars that have already been recalled and not fixed. So somebody at NHTSA had better be prepared to explain, and somebody up on the Hill, the Senate Commerce Committee, would be a really good place for somebody to ask why. And how in the world are you going to get, when you've gone from 12 to 20 million in the space of, the last, few months, how are you going to get to zero? There shouldn't be any recalled cars out there. But the older the cars get, before the recall notices start showing up in the mail, if they actually get to the owner, the older those cars are, as you know, the percentage of them that gets repaired goes down to nothing. And a lot of those recall notices are going to people who don't speak English, don't understand what the risks are. They're going to people who, they owned the car 4 years ago. They toss it in the trash. It looks like junk mail when it comes in. So the agency also needs to come up with a more modern way of communicating with actual owners of these cars. Now, the people who always know who owns cars that have killer airbags in them are the state DMVs. And so that agency should also be working with state DMVs, and Congress perhaps should be passing legislation that tells them you may not register a car that has a killer airbag in it, period. You hand it back to the person who's applying for the registration and say, go do yourself a favor and go, avoid getting your head blown off, and then come back and we'll register your car. That's what Australia did with their program. It's what Europe has done, and those countries essentially have come very close to completing their recall repairs.
Well, David Strickland was head of NHTSA when this was going on under the Obama administration. He's now the chief counsel to the Senate Transportation Committee. He could make a public hearing happen. He's got the ear of the chairperson, and he can make it happen. How about a letter from you directly to him asking for a public hearing?
I think the first thing I would want to know is some explanation from him as to why that 2009 investigation was killed.
Well, maybe he could be a chief witness, eh?
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at, yes.
Well, send a letter, because once we get these letters, we put them up on our website, we can organize some effort around something very concrete. So a letter from Jerry Cox to Secretary Buttigieg, and a letter from Jerry Cox to Chief Counsel of Senate Transportation Committee David Strickland, who goes way back on this Takata problem, would give us an opportunity to rally around those two goals to get to the bottom of this.
I'm glad to do anything, Ralph, that will keep people from getting blown up.
David, any questions?
Do any automakers manufacture the airbags here in the United States?
Interesting question. Because when I was working for Jack Danforth and we were trying so hard to keep the Reagan administration from canceling the requirement, the car manufacturers essentially drove all of the American companies that invented this technology out of the business. So they could say, we can't do it. We don't even have suppliers. The car manufacturer, and this is documented in the book, how they deliberately drove the people who invented this device out of the business of making it. And that's why everything that you see now comes from China, it comes from Japan, it comes from Europe, and from nowhere in the United States. I mean, there's some manufacturing facilities in the United States, but the companies are all based overseas because of that.
So it's harder to sue them.
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but first of all, you'd have to have some reason, and I think the Volvo TRW case is going to be extremely interesting. It's disappointing that the defect information report does not include information about what went on, and I wonder, is this the beginning of another Takata? Is it that all of the propellants will deteriorate if the car is 20 years old or 18 years old, or all of them deteriorating? And I think Volvo has an obligation to come forward with more information about what happened with the fatality that they reported about 3 months ago.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been talking with Jerry Cox, lawyer, public relation advisor, telling Takata the truth, which Takata rejected. And he's written this book. And remember, with your vehicle identification number, the VIN, you can get a history of the car you bought, especially if it's a used car, and you can get a history of whether and when and how it was recalled, if it was recalled for this purpose or any other defect that was the subject of a car dealer speaking for the manufacturer recall notice that you got in the mail.
And now more with Peter Bahouth.
Now, let me tell you something. I've seen something from the manufacturers, Ralph, that tell leaf blower operators ways that they can use leaf blowers 52 weeks of the year. You know, how to dry off your driveway with them, how to dry off your car with them. They're just unfettered.
How much do they cost to buy and maintain and fuel?
Oh, they're hundreds of dollars. The gas-powered leaf blowers are, I think the big ones are, as much, pretty close to $1,000, $800, right? The electric ones are cheaper. As I say, they're quieter. They don't put out as much pollution. But, there still is this issue of what are we trying to do here?
How fast do they burn through fuel?
How much fuel do they use? I don't have the answer to that, Ralph. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is that they put out as much pollution in an hour as driving a car from Chicago to Houston.
Where'd you get that figure?
It's been changed from time to time based on how much car pollution, it gets put out. But California has probably done the best job on studying this issue. They actually have put out a study that says, it's the California Air Board that put it out. And there was also a test by Edmunds, the car company. Edmunds, they're like a used car kind of place, but they also do study on different types of engines and different types of cars. But in California, they say that garden equipment will surpass the emissions of cars by 2022 in the state of California.
And there's no neighborhood, community, or city that has mobilized against this? I hear that Beverly Hills...
Yes, like I say, there's 325 communities that are trying to fight this across the country. It's just that, imagine, you have 325 separate efforts of groups trying to deal with, say, their city council or, whatever local jurisdiction they have, but no kind of overarching campaign with up-to-date good information with the things that these communities will need to take this battle on. And there's nothing at the national level, say at the EPA or with noise pollution or with going up against the manufacturer. Again, no air support. Any good campaign is going to be local and national, right? They're going to be linked up together and they're going to strategize in a way. Some things can be done nationally. Other things have to be organized locally, right? I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm just saying we only have one right now.
Okay, when you say over 300 communities are trying to do something about it, you mean they've already passed ordinances?
No, they're working on it. They've either passed an ordinance or they've failed to get an ordinance or they're trying to get an ordinance. But the problem is, for example, in Atlanta, let's take Atlanta. If you go to the Atlanta City Council, you can't have the city council regulate air pollution, for example, because that's the purview of the state legislature, right? Mm-hmm. So then what do you do, right? So they try to do it on noise level, right? Or they try to get the city council to understand it as something that is for the benefit of people to ban them or for the general welfare of the public to ban them. But that's a pretty hard lift. We're talking about, I mean, I talk to people that are like, they're home with a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they're very worried about their kid's health. They want to know, how do I get started? What do I do? I mean, that's where we are right now. You know, you've got residents and people that have actually, you know, this isn't what they do, is take on these battles saying, what do I do? This is a horrible problem. I don't want my kids
It's
breathing
also
this
a
air.
big problem for the elderly who sleep during the day,
Absolutely.
worried about their hearing. Where's AARP on this?
I don't know. The American Lung Association put out something a number of years ago. It was a statement that these things were, you know, garden equipment that used two-stroke engines were dangerous. But there's really no kind of effort behind it. There's no real campaign behind it. You know, the information's a little out of date. There's not even a central website for this cause.
Speaking of websites, how do people reach you with some feedback or requests?
Well, I have an email. It's P as in Peter, B as in boy, AHOUTH @gmail.com. Or
Peter, but while we're talking, I've been interrupted by 4 robocalls. So you get the robocalls inundating people inside their homes and these leaf blowers and other similar equipment outside their homes. There's got to be a dramatic way to raise visibility. And what David is saying is what you used to do up there in Alaska. You get in front of Black & Decker with all these leaf blowers, and you'll get national news. And that's the first step.
Okay. You know what this would be great at? A Larry David episode. I mean, I think these things should be ridiculed. You know, I think to the residents, you know, I do think we need that national attention on the manufacturers, but I also think the people that are hiring these companies should feel like, you know what? This is stupid. It's unnecessary. You know, you're being rude. Haven't we had enough rudeness in the past 4 years, Ralph? Do we have to just fight rudeness by being even more rude? Can't we just like get the point across? Be kind to your neighbors. Be kind to nature. Stop being rude all the time. It's like we've gone into this era of we don't care about our consequences and what results our actions have on other people.
Other than the noise, I don't think one neighbor out of 100 who hire these leaf blowers know anything about how deadly and concentrated the pollution is.
You are 100% right.
So it's an information effort too.
Yes, I agree. I've been saying that. We need that support. All these groups that are rising up or people that are saying, wow, this is kind of ridiculous, should have access to that information. But, you know, that takes a little bit of resources. It takes an organization. I mean, I'm retired, Ralph. I'm 67 years old, you know. I'm just trying to live my life. I'm trying to do things in my life, right? I don't have a job in these organizations anymore. I'm willing to take this fight on as much as I can, but there's got to be an organization that can do this on a daily basis, that could put this information out, you know. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying there's a lack right now of providing the air support and the air cover. I'm willing to help get it as best I can. You know, I'm trying to put the word out. I talk to all my neighbors.
You give interviews, right? You give interviews, national interviews, NPR?
You're the first.
All right, let me get Steve in. Steve, do you see any satiric ridicule that you can put a show on in this?
Well, sure. I mean, it's battling neighbors. And I had the same suggestion as David, is that you get a handful of people, and if you didn't want to use the actual leaf blowers, you get boom boxes with the noise. And I was thinking you do that for the around the house at 6 a.m, the new EPA director. And then you get your press and you get the thing, publicized. That's what occurs to me as a dramatic way to bring attention to this.
Is it illegal for you to voluntarily blow the leaves of a congressperson or the CEO of Black & Decker? This is you're a good Samaritan. Go to the homes of these people who have influence and stand outside and blow their leaves for them.
You won't find a leaf on their lawn, I guarantee you.
Well,
haven't you seen it around your neighborhood? Where do you guys live? First of all, by the way, Washington, D.C. has done a really good job on this. You've got James Fallows, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's a fantastic writer. He's publicized it. He's a much better writer than I am, and he's organized musicians and other people in D.C. But people in D.C. know how to fight these fights, right? In Atlanta, it's kind of like, well, good for you and bless your heart. It's different. Washington D.C. is kind of used to these types of things, and you're still fighting it. You asked James Fowles about this. How many years has he been working on this issue, and they still don't have enforcement through the city council yet?
I didn't know he was into this. He was our intern years ago. He did the book on the Savannah River polluters.
He's a leader in this fight. I read his stuff all the time. He wrote a big thing in the Atlantic about leaf blowers. He's been fighting this for years. Have him on the show. Ask him about it.
Look him up, listeners. Jim Fallows, Fallows. And he works for the Atlantic. He's got a regular blog every day.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he'd love to hear from you as well.
I agree with him 100%. And I get, when I hear noise, if somebody's blasting their stereo, airplanes, it creates unnecessary anxiety, and I can't concentrate. This is a serious problem.
That's exactly what it is, anxiety.
David, there was a poll of New York City residents of what irritates them the most. Guess what came in first? Noise.
Sirens, yeah.
Noise.
I promise you, my blood pressure goes up when those things come out. I promise you. I know it does. I mean, you can't shut your ears down, right? So a lot of people that I talk to, they're told, well, why don't you wear headphones? That's like telling people, why don't you sleep during the day? Because I want to play music loud at night. I mean, I don't, I shouldn't have to shut my ears down while you're out there for an hour taking leaves off your lawn. It's absurd. You know what happened, you guys? You may remember. We were promised jetpacks, and what we got were leaf blowers.
Yes, at least I would put up with it if I could fly.
Peter, has anybody written a book on this?
No, not that I know of.
Seems to be a simple.
Who's going to aggravate themselves even more reading about leaf blowers?
Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book about 10 years ago about how peace and quiet in nature has become the province of the wealthy. That the only way you can get peace and quiet now is if you're part of the 1%.
Well, I think here's the other thing I think you're up against,
people
Peter.
That live the 1% neighborhoods, you're getting the leaf blowers. So, I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't know about that. I mean, other noises, like people say, well, how about a motorcycle going by? Yeah, for 10 seconds, not for an hour.
Well, I think the other thing you're up against is you look out your window and the person on the leaf blower is the poor Mexican gardener who's working for the landscaping company.
That's right.
And so you're initially going, well, if I complain about this, is this guy going to lose his job? And
I hear that from neighbors all the time. Oh, I don't want them to lose their job. Well, I say, well, then pay attention. What about when they lose their hearing? Are you going to help them out then? Or, when they have respiratory problems? They don't have health care. They don't have health care, these workers. They're not even wearing, a lot of times I see them out there, they're not even wearing protective gear. They're not wearing masks. They're not wearing covering on their ears.
That's the approach.
I've got a next door neighbor. I've been here 22 years. He moved in here 2 years ago. He's got 2 young girls. They come every week for an hour, whether it's needed or not, right? And he won't even talk to me. He says, you know what? It's my property. I'll do what I want. Not when it comes into my property, it isn't. Not when it comes into my property. I have to smell it, right? I have to breathe it. I have to hear it. He won't even talk to me.
Time out, Peter. Are leaf blowers faster to get the job done than rakes? I don't think so.
A lot of people say no.
No way. No, I mean, in front of a house, you can do a rake much faster.
Right.
So that's counter to the efficiency.
Award. That's why I give out the Golden Rake Award. That's why I always honor and I reward any rakers. And then I publicize it. So the people say, hey, look at those guys out there raking. I take a picture of them. I put it on my Instagram. And I say, here's a kid that came and raked outside. He gets the Golden Rake Award. He is now a member in the Order of the Rake. You make it something great. You make it something good.
Right.
Why do you hate leaf blowers? I hate the noise. I don't want my kids breathing the air. So every time I give out a Golden Rake, we've got a neighbor saying why he doesn't like a leaf blower, right? But see, these are just like small little efforts. I spent a lot of time on this, You can't expect people to do that. We need air cover.
This is why there's no solidarity among the 99%. We hate each other because of all the noise the neighbors are making.
Divide and rule. What if a publisher called you up and said, I want a 180-page quick book on leaf blowers? Would you do it?
I think I could. But I think it would be, I'm really kind of interested in, the way I spend my time when the leaf blowers are going is I just can't sit here and fume. I have to do things. So I'm writing this screenplay about two neighbors, start out regular, just welcome each other to the neighborhood. There's a guy in the Hamptons, Ralph, listen to this. He was so annoyed at his neighbors complaining about his leaf blowers. He put a mechanization, he put a machine in his yard that opens up and 10 leaf blowers come up and blow the leaves away. That's what he did. He spent that much money just to say screw you to his neighbors.
I don't think the dog.
It's laughable.
There's 75
Tell
million
me this
dogs.
This is the basis for a great movie, right?
75 million dogs who don't like leaf blowers.
That's right. Dogs Against Leaf Blowers. I think that's maybe the organization.
Ralph, listen, I was talking to a friend of mine about it. He goes, I just got contacted by a service that'll come and pick up the dog poop off my lawn every week. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I mean...
And then the funny thing is the guy comes with a leaf blower to blow the poop off the lawn.
My next door neighbor's yard is dead, Ralph. 200-mile-per-hour winds. What do you think that does to your lawn?
Oh man.
Yeah.
The reason why this hasn't risen to a high level, David, Steve, everybody, is because there's a self-censorship going. People are afraid of their neighbors. They all shut up about it.
Yes.
And it's almost like the manufacturers have a cultural enforcement mechanism at the neighborhood level.
They know that. Exactly right, Ralph. So you know that you only get one label in your life, right? I used to be the Greenpeace guy. Then I was the treehouse guy because I have this famous Airbnb in my backyard, right?
Yeah.
And now I'm the leaf blower guy. Everybody goes, everybody makes a joke. What are you going to do? Everything's got to be about the leaf blower. They all laugh at me and they chuckle and everything else. And it's kind of like it's nervous. It's nervousness. They don't like to confront each other. They won't confront each other.
Yeah.
Maybe you should take a little personal responsibility. You spent your whole life speaking about planting trees. Well, the chickens have come home to roost. The leaves.
Yeah. Hey, we live in a forest.
Never thought of that, did you?
Atlanta was built in a forest. We love our trees. We hate their children.
Yeah.
One thing you need to talk up. It's much less. It's much more time consuming. That's what I know a landscape guy who uses low income people for leaf blowers. I could never figure out because he operates on efficiency. How many guys can serve how many homes? And I watched them. It's unbelievable how much slower it is than just using rakes. How do you?
I'll tell you another thing, Ralph. This was never a problem 3 or 4 years ago. It wasn't.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
It didn't exist.
Leaf blowers have been around for years.
Not everybody wanted a leafless lawn. For some reason, that's become the norm, right? We have traded our sanctuary in our house for the sanctity of a lawn, the number one crop in America.
What about GMO trees that don't shed leaves? Like, why don't we?
Supposed to shed leaves.
Well, why don't we start using genetically modified? Why don't we use CRISPR to create trees that don't suffer from alopecia?
He's put his comedian hat on, Peter.
I see.
This is what Triumph the dog has done to him.
In Japan, there's a philosophy that the fallen leaf is as beautiful as the leaf on the tree, and that's a true thing because without the leaves, the little trees don't have the insulation to get a good start in the spring to grow a little faster. You get the fireflies get wiped out and the Luna moths because they lay their larvae in the leaves. That's winter home for them, and we're just blowing them away. That's why one of the strongest groups fighting leaf blowers in the country are the pollinator groups, the native plant groups, because they know the damage it's causing. Okay.
Peter, I'm gonna pitch on your screenplay here. The first 2 acts, you first act is setting up the problem. Second act is developing this rivalry between these 2 neighbors who almost kill each other. And then something happens where they then decide, wait a minute, why are we fighting each other? And the third act is they go after Big Leaf. They go after the industry and they bond together to go after Big Leaf.
My ending was a little different. First of all, it has to be a comedy, right?
Well, that's what I'm pitching.
They both go way beyond their principles because, you can't let the terrorists win, right?
Right.
I can't give it up. If he keeps going with the mechanized leaf blowers in his backyard, I've got to think of some subtle way to get into territory into his head, right? So we keep doing things that get out of hand. Eventually it involves the whole neighborhood. People are horrified. But what happens at the end when it comes down to like some horrible thing that happens and the cops want to know who's responsible?
Mm-hmm.
They're on the side of the anti-leaf blower guy because he's a better neighbor, right? So they come up with an alibi for him, right? That's kind of the end.
Right.
Because the anti-leaf blower guy's got to win. He really does.
Yeah.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak to John Dacey about abolishing private prisons and NYU professor Sinan Antun about Trump's Iraq Blackwater pardons. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting